maybe. All right. I think we're live. Excellent. Welcome everyone to our MOA Live Talks. Today we are talking about Bishop's Block, which was a major excavation that was undertaken by ASI, Archaeological Services, in 2007. So I'm going to be talking about that. I've got probably overcomplicated setup. That's okay. So this was a collection that we have here at the museum now. It was transferred to the Museum of Ontario Archaeology in 2019. So this came to about 115 boxes after repackaging, which is really an incredible amount of material. Several objects from it have been featured on our artifact spotlight and are also in our Google Arts and Culture page, if you've ever checked those out or would like to. And then there's also a physical exhibit by ASI that was put up at the site of the Shangri-La Hotel in 2012, and that is still there. So maybe sometime in the future when we can get out again, if you're interested in seeing more material from the site and seeing a little bit more of its story, that's something that you could check out as well. I will drop a link to the website for that exhibit. There's not, just to give you a little bit more background on it when I'm finished this talk, because I'm kind of switching between things a little bit too much. So with that said, I'm going to switch over to my actual slide deck here since I'm casting from Zoom today. So here we go. Bishop's Block. So as I said, it's a stage 4 excavation conducted by ASI in 2007. So Bishop's Block is how the area was referred to in the 19th century when it was located on Newgate Street and Grave Street. So you can see that little red box sort of outlines the area of the excavation itself. So the streets have been renamed and changed and whatnot. And so the section of townhouses that we're discussing really is now basically on Adelaide Street, I can say that word, instead of Newgate, and instead of Grave Street, it's Simcoe. So it's a corner of Adelaide and Simcoe. And then we've got, you can see how our little red triangle here is sort of truncated triangle, quadrilateral, is sort of got an angle to it. And that is because university sort of runs through that diagonally now. So today it's sort of at the intersection of, well, not, they don't intersect, but it's on Adelaide between Simcoe and University, essentially. So the area of this block on it was a section on University, so like 180 to 188 University was slated for development, and that's what triggered the initial archaeological assessment. So you can see sort of here where it is today. You can see the Shangri-La Hotel, which is where the exhibit I mentioned is currently set. So if you are ever, like if you're in Toronto or if you're ever up that way and we're allowed to travel and visit exhibits again, then there is some material there that you can go and check out. So for the site, the stage 1, once the site was slated for development, that triggered the stage 1 assessment. So basically just sort of some research to determine whether or not there's anything there of potential. And so there's actually one standing structure there still. You can kind of see it under that yellow circle corner, kind of on the corner of Simcoe and Adelaide. And that actually does relate to the original construction of a set of townhouses there in the 1830s. Which was, so the one that's standing there now is basically 2 of those original townhouses, plus some additional structures that sort of all built together to make it a single building now. But in 2006, ASI conducted a stage 2 to test to see whether or not there were intact features under the existing parking lot. So basically where the hotel is now on that Google map, there was a parking lot at the time. And they did find quite a few features. So they did this, they did basically a test trench, which is referred to later on as trench 1. And how they did that, and the rest of the trenching on the site was with a backhoe. So basically just peeled off that sort of top layer of asphalt just to see what might be still intact underneath it. And they actually found quite a few features. So that was enough to trigger moving on to a stage 4. So that's where it went in the the summer and fall of 2007. So this was one of the first large scale urban archaeological excavations that took place in Toronto, which came about because of the city's archaeological master plan, plus related provincial regulations from the Planning and Heritage Acts as well. So the fieldwork was carried out between July 16th and October 19th, so a good long season there to go through all of this. And of course, the lab work took a lot longer to get through than the field excavation as well. So they dug 6 more trenches during the stage 4 excavation, picking up the numbering with 2, so trenches 2 to 7, and peeling back again that top layer with a smooth bucket of a backhoe just to sort of peel off until they were able to find the remnant archaeological features that had been buried, and then carrying out the rest of that excavation by hand once they were exposed. So in the end, they identified 39 lots, which are basically, it's a way of organizing when you're trying to keep track of everything that's happening. So organizing major features and structures and even some like notable artifacts as well. So that's a lot can refer to any of those things. So all the artifacts that came out of a particular feature or were associated with a particular structure and so forth. So 39 of those, which all came together to be over 67,000 artifacts. That is a lot of artifacts. It's a lot. It's 115 boxes. So it was a significant site. So it was selected for a stage 4 excavation because it represented this early townhouse development in Toronto. So you can see here sort of an overall site the overall area rather. You can see sort of where the trenches are, and I've got a close up here as well, just to sort of, you can see a little bit more clearly where the standing structure is. So lots 10 and 9 on that map represent what would have originally been townhouse 1 and 2. And then these other lots represent where the other townhouses are standing. You can see it's offset a little bit, and that's because they didn't want to undercut the original structure because they knew that it was going to end up being a pretty deep. So everything is just offset a little bit from the original actual lot numbers. And then in trench 7, they ended up not finding any cultural materials. Like they wanted to test and see if there was anything remaining there, but there was not anything really notable in trench 7. So most of the finds are from trenches 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Trench 1, which we don't see on this map, actually basically ran through the center of trench 2. But this is just showing you what was excavated in that stage 4 excavation. So it was selected for stage 4 because it represented this early townhouse development in Toronto. ASI researchers were actually able to trace the land ownership pretty well for not only to they were able to trace the development of actual construction, but they were able to trace back the original purchase of the lots to the early 18th century. But it's named Bishop's Block after John Bishop, who is the one who actually constructed the townhouses in question, probably in the 1830s, maybe like 1829. But basically, we're looking at the 1830s. So Bishop, he was a butcher. He was also a landlord. So at one point, he owned up to 11 buildings at a time or buildings or town lots, I should say, in York, which of course is the original name for Toronto, which made him a major property owner in this period. So in 1833, the records demonstrate that he owned 11 buildings that were at least 2 stories that had 2 to 3 fireplaces each. So that's, quite a lot of real estate. And 5 of those were in this area that we refer to as Bishop's Block. So they are townhouses. So because we have really good records from censuses and city directories and so forth from Toronto from this period, we know pretty specifically who lived in each of these buildings from the period of their construction through various renovations until they were eventually torn down in the second half of the 20th century. So the first, I think, was torn down in 1962, and then the others later up until the 1980s. So I'm not going to go through each of these building expansions, like the actual structural history too much, but I will try and pull out some broad strokes of the changes over time and how they were used, because I think that's really the interesting story that this archaeological project tells us about what's going on in what's essentially the heart of Toronto. So I would like to point out that the richness of this historical documentation is really great because in some cases we can associate specific deposits that we're finding archaeologically with specific occupations. So I hope you're ready for a few more maps. So we've got our nice trenches here. And then if I move us forward here, you can again see this is 1899 fire insurance map. And so you can see things are getting a little bit more developed by the end of the 19th century, moving into the 20th century. That's really kind of the story we want to tell. But you can see that these structures here on the corner are still there. They've been joined by some other townhouses, and the numbers that you see here are the lot numbers. So if I can go back to my previous slide. So you can see how we've got these lot numbers here. So we're really looking at the excavation wise from between lots 8 to lot 5. So you can see here it goes, you can sort of read those numbers. I guess they're not super clear on just because I had to blow this up enough, but you can get the idea that there's a lot of these different houses that are being developed. It's a lot more infilled than the original map that I showed you, where we really just had those 5 houses sort of clustered together on this in that block. So over time, the town lot that was originally purchased by John Bishop was divided into house lots. So originally it was just a much larger plot of land, how they were looking at it. It was divided into these house lots. And when the trenches were placed, as I said, they overlapped them more or less. And for the most part, the trenches are connected to these specific houses. So trench 7, as I said, was a test trench to see if they could find any cultural remains behind the standing structures, and they were not able to. As I said, the 2 standing townhouses, which are now part of the standing building, and then we have the trenches that focuses on house 3, 4, and 5. And they also, if I can go back again, you can see trench 6 sort of overlaps a little bit of lot 5 as well. And so there was a later townhouse that was constructed there, and it sort of caught that trench caught a lot of the features that were associated with it. And it was known as 184 Adelaide. And so we've got a little bit of information about that structure in this talk as well. So it was not part of the original townhouses, but it did was part of sort of the general development of this neighborhood over time. So for some extra context, you could see in that first map that I showed you that it was really an open place. It was not very urban. People were still keeping farm animals in their yards, even though they were living in these sort of fancy townhouses. And then over the course of the 19th century, the city did become more urbanized, as you can see here. And we can really see that in the way that the use of these properties changed and developed. And so this is actually what you're seeing now is a picture of the excavation taken a little bit from above, so you can see some of those features. So you can see sort of the houses that I talked about. So house 3, then house 4, house 5, and then sort of that little line down the edge of 184 Adelaide. You can sort of really get a sense of where these lots and houses are. If you're looking in house 3, that sort of deeper section in the middle is actually where trench 1 was originally set. So that's what you're seeing there. And then we've got some other features here. We've got a bunch of privies, which are always fun. I'm just going to move my Zoom thing down here so that it's not in the way of any of the slides. So you can see we've got some privies, and these big circular things that you're seeing here are cisterns. So they were there to collect rainwater, essentially, if you're not familiar with cisterns, which most people don't really have those today. So fair. So we're going to start talking about Townhouse 3. So this was a family home up until about the 1870s. And it was actually a home of some fairly affluent people, some people who were important to the early history of Toronto. And then in about the 1870s, it actually became a boarding house. So instead of having a single family, we have like just a stream of different people who were living here for short periods of time all together, renting from the person who owned the property, who was also sort of serving like, you know, it's a boarding house. So people are living there, but the house owner, who's the person who's running this boarding house, is also living there, preparing meals for people and so forth. So it's got a communal feel to it more than necessarily an apartment building the way we think of them today would. So then in 1905, it would actually change again. It became more of a commercial property, became a laundry, so a Chinese laundry. And then later on in the 1920s, it became a Chinese restaurant. So most of this was a really rich feature area. You can see there's 2 privies. They uncovered a lot of stuff when they did that first trench that was enough to tell them that, you know, yes, this is going to be worth a full excavation in this area. And so most of these features do relate to this Bishop's Block kind of period. So Townhouse 4, just moving over a little to the right, is very similar kind of history. So it starts as a sort of family households, or like 1 or 2 families living there at a time. Then it was a boarding house again until about the 20th century, and then it became a commercial enterprise. Again, we've got some fairly affluent early occupants. And we know that at least one of the mid-19th century occupants of House 4 may have also had a shop there. So Townhouse 5 was actually the last of the Bishop's Blocks buildings that was built there. And pictures of it, which I unfortunately don't have to share with you, or historical photos, showed that it really had a kind of a different look than the other ones. The others were fairly standard in their original construction. This one was slightly taller, had different windows, just a little bit of a different like aesthetic to it. So it was built in 1836, and the first occupation of this building was actually a ladies' school, which I thought was kind of neat. Then once, like the other ones, it was a single family home until about the 1880s. And then, like the other ones, it became a boarding house. And in 1901, this one actually reverted to being a single family home. So while the other ones, houses 3 and 4, went sort of more commercial route. With House 5, it goes back to being family dwelling in that period. So then 184 Adelaide, which is to the right of the townhouses, and again, just sort of caught in the edge of Trench 6. I tried to draw the trenches in here on my photo, but I couldn't make it look anywhere decent. So I apologize if I don't have those super well outlined. But it was, it wasn't actually built until the 1860s. So about 20 to 30 years later, depending on which of these houses we're looking at. And then it was a hardware merchant who lived there. And so we don't really know much about this structure for another 20 years. So there's an 1880s map, which lists it as a single family home, a two-story brick structure with a stable out back that was used as a single family home up until that point. And then after that, again, we're not really sure. There's some questions about what's going on there. We know that it was a family home that had lodgers, so similar to a boarding house, but with more of a family. So instead of being like a single person running a boarding house, it was a family who also had lodgers in the early 20th century. And then it reverted to a single family home again. And then it was demolished actually before the rest of the other structures. Also, it was done in the 1950s. So overall, a shorter life for 184 Adelaide. But we can see the sort of overall trend in the neighborhood, right? So we start with these family homes in the semi-rural area. Then it becomes, as the city gets more built up around it, we're starting to see more of these boarding houses and lodging homes. So we have individual workers living there, so it's less families. And it sort of is related to the general urbanization of Toronto. And then from there, we move into sort of more of a commercial and a more mixed commercial residential kind of area, which is what we see in a lot of Toronto today, really, especially in sort of the downtown core. So we can also see that it wasn't really taking place. It wasn't exactly the same. So House 3, it's got a little bit of an early start to its life as a boarding house in the 1870s. Houses 4, 5, whatever, the other ones starting a little bit later than that. But you can really can sort of imagine how this is changing the character of the neighborhood overall as well. And so we can actually see these changes, these trends in the artifact assemblage to some extent as well. So ceramics are a really strong way that we see that. And I'm gonna move ahead here, maybe. There we go. So ceramics in family homes might reflect more personal taste and choice in individual dining. So we've got some early ironstone, some sort of, you can see it's got that transferware that's got some nice bleeding to the pattern that was actually done on purpose for, again, just for aesthetic purposes. They thought it looked nice. And so this is more sort of individual dining things. And then in Townhouse 3 in the 1870s, we start to see more ironstone, like more of this type of stuff from other kinds of less durable ceramics. And this was introduced to Toronto markets or to Ontario markets in the 1840s, but really at that point was kind of an elite ware. And so, as I said, some of the early residences of townhouses 3 and 4 were more affluent, and so they could afford this sort of fancy stuff. As Ironstone continued to be in the market, it sort of came down it became more affordable So in the 1880s and 1890s, it was sort of more accessible, like everyday wear, and a little bit more robust as well. So earlier examples, more expensive and refined, and then later examples like the teacup here. So this is one of the objects that's on our, was one of our early artifact spotlights. It's on our Google Cultural Institute. So if you are Google Arts and Culture page, if you're interested in it in particular, you can go and check it out. But it was, it's a little bit more heavily built. It's not quite, it's got that nice design printed on it, but that's pretty simple technology for the time that we're looking at then. There's also sort of a trend as we get into the period in time where we see more boarding houses, where we actually see in the assemblages that there's more like communal serving dishes as well. So it's not just that the kinds of ceramics are changing, or that like the things are becoming more accessible, whatnot, but like the actual kinds of things that we're seeing really reflect that more sort of communal dining style of living as well, where you would have the person who's running the boarding house offer regular meals that everyone would come to. So we see that the preparation, like the kinds of cookware that you would need to prepare those kinds of communal meals, we see that coming in later as well. So again, you just sort of see this transformation that's reflected in the artifact assemblages. So we could also sometimes align assemblages with specific activities and occupations. So one of the things they found in the back of Townhouse 3 was actually some red earthenware that was associated with dairying vessels, and also this 2-gallon butter pot. So this is sort of evidence that people were indeed keeping farm animals in the area. They probably had a cow out back in the shed. There's some descriptions from this early period in the 1830s that talk about, somebody who lived there being able to hear a cow when she was sort of shut in the house during the winter, which she was not really impressed with either Toronto or the townhouse. But so like I said, we can get sort of more of a picture of what's going on and see these changes over time. So there's also some kind of fun personal insights to be had about the occupants as well. Both Townhouse 4 and 184 Adelaide had several bottles of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which again, this is an object that's featured on our artifact spotlight and in our Google Arts and Culture page. So this was actually a children's teething medicine, which, being the 19th century, contained both morphine and alcohol. So we know the bottles date to sometime between 1849 when they started making it, and around 1860 when the distribution company that was providing access to this in Ontario went out of business. So it gives us a little bit of insight as to maybe what was happening in these two homes. So in Townhouse 4 and in 184 Adelaide, they're going through quite a lot of this syrup. I think they pulled 10 bottles, I think, out of the back of Townhouse 4. So it's a lot of morphine and alcohol teething syrup to be going through in your home. Some of the other interesting medical artifacts recovered from the houses are glass syringes. So like this one, again, featured on our Google Arts and Culture page, that came out of Townhouses 3 and 5. And the privy behind 184 Adelaide Street, so actually produced 4 bottles of this Bogle's electric hair dye, which started being produced by William Bogle of Boston in 1844. It had a fairly long life. As we know, 184 Adelaide didn't actually get constructed until the 1860s. So this is clearly a product that had some longevity in the market. There were also some personal hygiene objects recovered from all of the houses. Toothbrushes were actually pretty common. They came out of most of the lots. There's also some toothpaste containers, so some little pots of toothpaste or dentifrice, as they called it at the time. And then we've got this partial set of dentures that was recovered from 184 Adelaide Street as well. So they're made of an acrylic resin, so it tells us that they're probably actually an early 20th century denture. So a little bit later than some of the early sort of heart of Bishop's Block, but still, kind of a fun, weird thing to find on an excavation. So there's also evidence of leisure. So we had There we go. Dominoes and doll parts were pulled out of, again, pretty much all of the houses. There's also miniature tea sets. It would have been for the dolls to use, of course. Marbles. There's graphite rods that came out of lamps that were in use at the time that kids would have then used as basically sidewalk chalk. So to draw on things that you're not supposed to be drawing on. There's also a lot of, there we go. Did I get this backwards? Yeah, I did. All right. Writing tools. So inkwells of stoneware. So like the one you see here, there are also glass ones, slates and pencils. So this one you can actually see has a little bit of writing still legible on it. And these, again, came from pretty much all of the contexts. I was hoping I could go back and see, you know, there was a particular increase that was associated with that early ladies' school in 184 Adelaide, but I don't think they actually saw that or able to identify that very clearly in the record. Unfortunately, that would have been neat. So there are also a lot of other kinds of home houseware sorts of things. Like there was a lot of sewing implements, so pins and needles and thread spools. This especially was associated with Townhouse 3. Although again, most of the others as well had these sorts of things. There are personal objects like jewelry, including, yeah, got everything out of backwards. All right, so we have this jet button here. We have a glass eardrop and 2 gold earrings as well. So these kinds of personal ornament coming out of these. And then of course, other things that I don't have images of, like these sort of ubiquitous white kaolin clay smoking pipes, which were molded with various designs representing different interests and hobbies. There's actually one from Townhouse 3, again, that had Masonic designs on it. So that's kind of a neat hint as to some of the things that people who were living there were involved in. And then there was just some other kinds of neat, or neat to me anyway, sorts of things that they found. Like fragments from eyeglasses, pieces of like parasols and fans and so forth that really sort of just represent this sort of 19th century culture the way it sort of is in my head anyway. So there's also, of course, there's a lot of evidence of food waste. There was really good faunal and floral preservation, of course, especially in the privies, which I talked about a little bit in my talk last week. So there was a really wide diversity of meat from different mammals and fish and fowl, with a lot of the meat coming from the kinds of expected domesticates, cow, pig, and like sheep or goat. And they mostly seem to have been professionally butchered. So there's some evidence from that there was home butchery as well, and that if it was being done, it was, you know, being done pretty competently. So there is a little bit of that going on. I suspect more of this sort of smaller animals like the fowl than necessarily home butchery of a whole hog, but maybe in that earlier period, we know that there were some people who were associated with these townhouses that were actually butchers. So in terms of plant remains, there's a lot of fruit represented, especially raspberry and strawberry seeds, partly just because they produce a lot of seeds. But there's also apples and figs. There's a lot of nuts like almonds, walnuts, like European walnuts, also chestnuts, and even coconut. So these foods would have been available in the local markets. And this shows us an interesting mix of sort of locally available plants and imported goods that would have had been easily to prepare and store for that sort of long voyage overseas. So kind of a mix of what's available to people who are living in this part of the city in the 19th century. So what all of this really documents is, like I said, that sort of changing landscape on Adelaide Street, previously Grave Street, from this sort of semi-rural upper middle class, really sort of range of single family homes to more fully urban, like working class enclave of boarding houses, and then commercial businesses by the early 20th century. So it's a really rich site in terms of being able to tell that kind of story of transformation of Toronto overall. And as I said, it's been a really great collection for us to use to help show off the richness and diversity of Ontario archaeological record from this period. So it also represents something I've mentioned in other talks. So again, there's like 67,000 objects here. That's really quite a lot of material coming out of a single excavation. And we can see how these big urban digs like this project from 2007 are really going to sort of change the nature of what we see overall in the Ontario archaeological record. So, and that's just because it can be so dense. So again, we're talking about like basically 3.5 house lots here. And that's just a lot of material and features and other records that are being generated by this work. So it's rare to have such a wealth of material from a small area on other kinds of sites. I think we have some large collections that come from like full village sites in the repository right now, but there are very few that really match this in terms of how much space it's taking up on our shelves. And so as we start to see more development in cities, we're going to continue to see these large projects that are generating this vast amount of archaeological materials and information. And that's one of the reasons that like just having a place to store this stuff that it can go and be taken care of is really kind of concern for archaeologists. So we at the museum, of course, are really pleased to be able to say that we have the capacity to offer that space in the Sustainable Collections Repository, and also that we can use this kind of material to help make it and its stories more accessible to the public. So, and I feel like there's a lot of potential for people to make really strong connections to these kinds of projects too, where it's easier maybe for people who live in cities today to sort of see themselves in the city dwellers of the past, to have that connection to a particular place where you're living now, or where you may have come from, or where you even have just moved to. So Toronto has a long history of being a place that has a lot of immigration, for example, and those are stories that we can start to see and tell. And we see that sort of in this sort of development of like working class urban areas, like Bishop Block became over time. So I think there's a lot of really interesting archaeology and interesting stories to tell coming out of these big urban sites, but it is, you know, again, just the vast volume of material is something that, you know, we have to put some thought into how we're going to manage in the future in terms of archaeology as an industry and as a discipline. So once again, if anybody has any questions, I apologize. I am not able to see the live stream currently, so I am not necessarily being able to answer your questions as they come up if anybody has any, but if you leave me a comment, I will get back to you, or somebody else at the museum will get back to you. And I will also leave a link to that ASI exhibit. And again, to our museum donation page again, if you are interested, if you've been finding these talks interesting, we do appreciate it if you could drop us just a few dollars even, just to say thank you for our time and so on. So I'm gonna find my Zoom window here, surely, and say goodbye. Thank you for joining me. Any minute now. Meeting controls. There we go. Thank you. Goodbye. Yeah.